One of the things that has interested me the most about Japanese history was their 265 years of isolation and the reason behind that, right? But most importantly, the culture that they saved by simply ignoring the rest of the world. Today, we are gonna talk about the Edo period of Japan, also known as the sakoku era. This time of isolation was like none other in human history. While most countries during the 1800s were being conquered and colonized by Europe, Japan managed to survive by simply having boundaries and closing their doors to the world. Everybody, I'm really excited to talk about this era of Japan, but first, let's hear a word from our sponsors. Do you like Japanese culture? And do you like Japanese tea ceremonies? Then you need to check this out. Asakusa Tea Ceremony School creates a sanctuary you can build inside your living room to have a space where you can relieve yourself of stress and free your mind of worldly things. Senshin-an has come up with a Chashitsu Zero, a compact tea house that you can assemble inside your house. The 2020 pandemic forced the closures of tea ceremony practices, and many people were missing the relaxing energy of Japanese tea rooms. But now you can build it at home thanks to Senshin-an. Japanese businessmen would have tea ceremonies to treat their guests. It is easy to build and does not take too much space. Build your own spot for clearing your mind and relaxation in your home or office. For more information, go to senshin-an.com and relieve yourself of stress. It was the Edo period, and it was being ruled by the Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu. Japan's system had a hierarchy in which many people could not escape their impoverished lives. 80% of the population were peasants who had to work in agriculture to provide a steady source of income for the upper classes. 40% of rice harvest had to be given as taxes to the emperor and higher class so that they can maintain their luxurious lives. During this time in 1603, the West was a threat to Japan. Also, they were getting out of the Sengoku era, which was a time of war and civil unrest that lasted from 1467 to 1615. It was absolute bloodshed. That time period was when Oda Nobunaga was still around. Tokugawa Ieyasu had united Japan under his shogunate after hundreds of years of constant civil uproar. Now, for some reason, the emperors and leaders of Japan at the time thought that the Sengoku War had happened because of the introduction of Christianity in the land of Japan by the Portuguese and foreign influences. In 1633, the Japanese military government saw that there was a possibility that Europe could colonize Japan. They were not going to let that happen, and as a result, they decided to lock down the country. So, you thought that the 2020 pandemic was the first time Japan locked down? Nope. They were way ahead of their time, my friend. They called it the sakoku policy, meaning locked country. And any Japanese who made contact with foreigners would be executed. They were not playing around. During this time, Japanese ships were also forbidden to leave Japan to go to other countries. On top of that, any foreign ships trying to enter Japan would be searched for any Catholics or priests trying to spread their religious messages. If any religious foreigners were found, they were told to either renounce their religion or be killed. I wonder, how did that go? Because if it were me, I would just say, I would just pretend like I gave up Christianity. This is where the end of the sakoku policy started, so pay attention. 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry sailed to Japan with the intention of forcing Japan into diplomatic trade with the West. It's kind of an oxymoron, if you ask me. You're going to be diplomatic, but force them at the same time? Great job, Perry. Great job. During this time, Europe was all over Asian countries, sailing the Asian seas, seeking more conquest. So our boy Matthew Perry brought his ships to the shores of Japan. and refused to leave until the Japanese signed a treaty that would allow American ships to dock in Japanese ports for fuel and supplies. Eventually, this continued, and this led to the end of the sakoku policy of Japan. It became hard to continue with this policy. The Japanese were threatened, and it seemed as though the emperor was afraid of being attacked by Westerners who had cannons and other weapons designed by Leonardo da Vinci himself, for God's sakes. Afterwards, Japan would go on to adopt many Western things and technology at the time. They began to use Western clothing and design. They built trains, which only took them about 20 years to master. I mean, good God, imagine that. Imagine that. It took the West 200 years to innovate all that technology back in the 1800s, and it only took Japan 20 years to master it. Isn't that crazy? If it wasn't for the sakoku policy, Japan would have lost so much of its rich culture that we have grown to love today and that we see in anime and movies. For example, haiku poetry, woodblock prints, matcha tea ceremonies, kabuki dramas, bonsai tree cultivation, and traditional Japanese landscape gardening. The geishas and the samurais were around way before the end of the Edo period. The samurai's history goes way back to 1185, while the first geisha is recorded to have appeared in the 13th century. So, to answer the question, why did Japan isolate itself for 265 years? It was to avoid being conquered and colonized by Europe, but also to avoid influence that Christianity brought to the people. The Japanese had their own way of life, and they refused to give it up. So, did you enjoy this piece of Japanese history? If so, then make sure to subscribe. I also talk about anime, manga, video games, geek culture, Japanese culture on this channel. So if you are interested in any of those things, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Thank you guys for watching. This is your boy, Andy Matrix. Godspeed.